In this video, I'll tell you about our work on joint frequency and image space learning for MRI reconstruction and analysis. Our question of interest is, if you're building a neural network to do image reconstruction or artifact correction from corrupted case space data, what's the core layer structure you should start with? We want this layer to be easy to implement. We want it to be easily composable with other task-specific layers and architectural constraints. So for example, for the undersampled reconstruction problem, many previous works have shown that having a data consistency layer is helpful, and we want to be able to easily incorporate that kind of constraint into our architectures. We also want our layer to handle several different types of corruptions so that if multiple corruptions are present simultaneously, networks comprised of these layers will still perform well. To that end, our key idea is to use joint layers, which contain convolutions in both image and frequency space. The intuition is that this joint learning strategy enables correction of artifacts native to the frequency space, while also allowing manipulation of image space representations to reconstruct coherent image space structures. We define two flexible task-independent layer structures which incorporate this joint learning strategy. And we demonstrate these layers in several experimental setups. First, we show that simple networks comprised of joint layers outperform networks operating solely in the frequency space or solely in the image space. This finding holds for a wide variety of artifacts, including motion corruption, heavy noise, and combinations of artifacts such as undersampling and motion corruption present simultaneously. We also show that our layers can be combined with data consistency layers, which have been previously shown successful for the undersampled reconstruction task. The resulting networks compare favorably to other state-of-the-art networks. Finally, we show that our joint layers can be dropped directly into previously developed unrolled networks for undersampled reconstruction, which improves training behavior and significantly speeds up the training process. The rest of this video will walk through our two core layer structures and provide an overview of each set of experiments. The primary difference between our two types of joint layers is the way that the frequency and image space convolutions are composed. Here's a diagram of our first proposed layer structure, which I'll refer to as the alternating layer. The layer of interest is highlighted by the light purple dotted line. Within this layer, the convolutions are applied in series, with the network alternating between frequency space convolutions shown in red and image space convolutions shown in blue. All of the intermediate features in these layers are complex valued, with separate channels representing both real and imaginary components. In our second proposed layer structure, here called interleaved, the frequency and image space convolutions are learned in parallel. At every layer, we maintain separate sets of frequency and image space features shown in red and blue respectively. Note that these sets of features are not constrained to be directly related via the Fourier transform. The two sets of intermediate features are linearly combined at each layer, and then convolutions are applied in both the frequency and the image space. Our first experiment compares joint networks with single space networks that perform convolutions solely in the frequency space or solely in the image space. These simple networks do not incorporate any task-specific data consistency operations often used for undersampled reconstruction tasks. This experiment is particularly useful for understanding how different layer structures perform on other tasks, such as motion correction, where the acquired measurements may be incorrect. We perform this experiment using a large dataset of T1 weighted brain MRIs, and we simulate a range of artifacts in the single coil setting, including motion corruption, noise, undersampling, and a combined artifact with motion corruption occurring during an undersampled acquisition. All simulation details can be found in the paper. Here's a sample from the motion corruption setup. The first column shows the ground truth we're trying to reconstruct, while the second shows the simulated motion corrupted input. In addition to the full image, we're also visualizing a zoomed in patch, the patch difference image, and the case space for each image. These next two columns show reconstruction from the pure frequency space and pure image space baselines. Finally, the last two columns show reconstructions from our joint networks. Our networks produce sharper, more accurate reconstructions than the single space baselines. And while I've just shown one example here, this trend holds very consistently across test examples. This figure shows quantitative results for each corruption type. Each plot corresponds to one type of corruption. The x-axis shows the index of each subject within our test set, and the y-axis shows the SSIM of the network reconstructions. So a higher score is better here. Red and blue dots correspond to single space network reconstructions from the pure frequency and pure image space networks, while the two shades of purple correspond to our two types of joint networks. For nearly every subject and every experiment, our joint networks outperform the single space networks. In our second set of experiments, we study the interaction of our joint layers with a data consistency operation used in many state-of-the-art networks designed specifically for undersampled reconstruction. This data consistency operation directly replaces the k-space lines in a network output or intermediate estimate with the true acquired values at those lines. We use the same data set as in the previous set of experiments and simulate several different undersampling setups. We simulate 4x and 8x accelerated undersampling with a fully sampled central region. We also simulate undersampling with an acceleration factor of 4, with k-space lines selected completely randomly and no fully sampled central region. This challenging undersampling pattern measures how well different methods perform under non-traditional acquisition schemes. For example, when using a learned scan-specific acquisition pattern. As before, here are a sample ground truth output and corrupted input for the random undersampling acquisition pattern. The next column shows the results produced by a simple UNet trained to perform undersampled reconstruction. The following two columns show the results of two state-of-the-art methods for undersampled reconstruction. CascadeNet intersperses a data consistency operation with image space convolutional layers. The Kiki network contains 4 subnetworks operating in k-space, image space, k-space, and image space, respectively, with data consistency operations after each k-space subnetwork. The final two columns show reconstructions from our networks, which in contrast to the Kiki architecture, incorporate frequency and image space convolutions at every layer, and for this task, apply a data consistency constraint only at the end of the network. While the state-of-the-art networks produce high-quality reconstructions, a few artifacts persist in their reconstructions as highlighted by the red arrows. Our joint networks improve the reconstructions of these details. This figure summarizes the quantitative results of our second set of experiments. Each plot corresponds to a different undersampling pattern, with our joint networks in purple and the comparison networks in other shades. As before, a higher SSIM score along the y-axis indicates a better reconstruction. For the uniform sampling patterns, our joint networks perform comparably to the state-of-the-art networks. For the more challenging random undersampling pattern, our joint networks outperform the state-of-the-art architectures. For our third set of experiments, we studied the interaction of our joint layers with unrolled networks popular for undersampled reconstruction. We specifically study modal, a version of an unrolled network with an architecture that appears on the slide. Each iteration first passes the input through image space convolutional layers that serve as a data-driven regularizer. Then, modal applies an analytical update, which effectively encourages data consistency between the output and the acquired measurements. This process is repeated for several iterations, with the convolutional weights shared across iterations. In this work, we compare this standard modal setup with a version that replaces the image space convolutions with our inner leaf layers. We run this experiment on the 3D multi-coil T2 cube images used to perform the original modal experiments. As in the original modal experiments, the data is undersampled with a variable density undersampling mask with acceleration factor 6. The original modal work notes significant training instabilities when training a network with 5 iterations. Instead, that work trains a network with 1 iteration and uses the learned weights to initialize a 5-iteration network, which is then fine-tuned. In contrast, when our joint layers are inserted into the modal network, we are able to directly train a network with 5 iterations. These are the two versions of the networks that we compare. These plots show the metrics for the standard modal setup in blue and our modal setup with joint layers in purple. Networks with 1 iteration are shown in a lighter shade, while the full networks with 5 iterations are shown in a darker shade. The purple modal networks with our joint layers achieve high-quality reconstructions significantly faster than the standard modal setup with image space convolutions. Qualitatively, we can see that the standard modal setup produces fuzzy reconstructions at the 10th epoch of training, while the modal network with our joint layers has already essentially achieved the final reconstruction quality attained by both networks. This table compares the total training time required for each strategy. When accounting for the pre-training required for the standard modal setup, our modification with joint layers achieves almost an order of magnitude speedup to attain the same reconstruction quality. Taken together, our experiments show that joint neural networks combining convolutions in the image and frequency space are a promising strategy for correcting corrupted k-space data. These layers are useful as a standalone tool for correcting artifacts including motion corruption, heavy noise, undersampling, and combined artifacts, and these layers can be combined with task-specific strategies such as data consistency constraints for undersampled reconstruction. More details about this work can be found in our paper and our publicly available code on GitHub. and we're happy to answer any further questions via email.